Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Michelle Barsky. I'm from Fruit and Vegetable Magazine. I'm joined today by Andrea DeGroot, Agricultural Transition Specialist with FCC. Today, during our session, Andrea will outline beginning steps in your farm transition plan, help set expectations, and identify who you will work with. Special thanks to FCC for sponsorship of our webinar today. FCC is Canada's leading agriculture and food lender with a healthy loan portfolio of more than $38 billion. FCC provides flexible, competitively priced financing, management software, information and knowledge specially designed for the industry. For more information, you can visit fcc.ca. So this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all attendees and registrants approximately 24 hours after the live broadcast. The session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 to 60 minutes. So Andrea will speak for 45 minutes, and then following her presentation, we'll open the virtual floor for questions. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel of your computer screen. So this webinar has been approved for one CCA CEU in professional development. So further instruction for submission via QR code or by email will be addressed after the question and answer period. So without further ado, I'll let you take it away, Andrea.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. And if there's any questions, I won't be exactly watching the chat box, but I'm going to ask that Nash, if there's any questions throughout the time, feel free to jump in and maybe ask a question as well. So with that, we're going to be talking about transitioning your farm, and my job as a transition specialist at FCC, my whole goal today is to help give you some perspective of what's included in farm transition. And so as Nash already outlined about who Farm Credit is, one of the things that she didn't speak to is the fact that Farm Credit Canada is a self-sustaining crown corporation. And so part of that is that we actually reinvest some of our profits back into the industry. And that's really one of the core places where my team, the advisory team, actually came to be. So the need for advisory services was the fact that Farm Credit Canada from coast to coast was seeing that the demographics within our farmers was the age was increasing, and there was a lot of farms that were not transitioning from one generation to the next, and they were having a lot of challenges. And so through the advisory services, this is a complimentary service to not only FCC but to non-FCC clients as well. And our whole goal is to get you started, or is to meet you wherever you're at. Because if you've already started and then kind of got stalled, sometimes we need translation of what the technical partners like your accountants and businesses are doing. In other cases, we have some varied expectations and we need to help facilitate a conversation. There's lots of different aspects that come into play when we're talking about a farm transition, but my role is that I want to help start that conversation. And I'm not an accountant and I'm not a lawyer, but for myself, I have had about 15 years in agricultural lending. So I've actually been on the flip side and helped finance farm transitions. I've also been active in the commercial agricultural finance sector. And in those cases, it was helping to transition the management of some of those farm businesses from one generation to the next. And so my goal is when I come into the business, I get to see lots of different businesses, and sometimes we take a very down to earth kind of approach and we talk about the operation as a whole and then start to build those building blocks so that we can work together with your technical partners to help build that transition plan. So as we start today, the reality is that farmers have so many things going on, and there's lots of time-sensitive issues. There's lots of different topics that are going on. I mean, we're in April. We have a lot of farms that are really excited to be getting out onto the ground. I know in my area, I'm also a farmer just outside of Stratford, and this weekend it was smelly. And so my kids were commenting on all the different kinds of manure because we're pig farmers, so it smelled like pigs, but then our next door neighbors are chicken, and then we have another dairy. So it was a whole combination of different manure smells, and then there was some conversation about whose shit smelled worse. It was a fantastic series of conversations. But right now, farmers are gearing up for busy. And so, especially if you are a crop farmer, this is your busy go time. But for livestock producers, this is also an extremely busy time because the demands of livestock don't slow down just because it's the spring. So, there's lots of things that are coming to be, but also with it being in April, we're talking with our accountants for taxes, we're dealing with our year ends. And in some of these cases, transition, it's one of those times of year that transition typically tweaks in people's eyes. They're like, okay, we really need, this is going to be the year that we actually start to have this conversation. And then the reality is, all of a sudden, back to back, you have busy days, the sun shining, and all of a sudden that conversation or maybe that urge to talk about transition gets set aside because the day to day is so busy. So with that, we're going to start talking about why you shouldn't set transition aside and why you need to put it top of mind. And the number one reason is that farm transitions take time. And if I can set one expectation is that this is going to be a process. It's not going to be a one-time event. And I mentioned before, we have a lot of building blocks, and that's where there's going to be parts of it that's asset based. So we're going to talk about how the assets are going to move from one generation to the next. We're going to talk about the legal and the structural way of how we're going to transition those assets, because there's personal ownership, we have corporate ownership, lots of details like that. But we also have management. How are we going to get the management to move from the senior generation to the younger generation? And how are we going to identify and support the senior generation as they look forward and want to continue into their retirement plans? So it's really important that everybody comes to the table, because the junior generation need to speak up and understand what's being asked of them. And the senior generation, likewise, we need to have a clear understanding of what they're doing, because this transition, the process will take years. And as we start to get into a little bit more of the details about transition itself, I think it's important to take a moment to stop and think about what are the terms that always go with transition, because transition seems to be a bit new. Succession was very common, and what that means is that's the transfer of the business. And so for many years, the whole conversation was typically right around that succession planning, and that recognized the transfer of assets. It also acknowledged the transfer of business. What it didn't acknowledge was that in many cases, the business or the farm is only part of the story, because the farmer themselves also identify as that business. And so if you're talking business plans, you also have to talk about farmer plans. And that's where the estate planning portion comes into it. And that is some of the transfer of assets, but it's also wills, it's about the retirement plan, and it's about taking care of the farmer. So if you look at it from that perspective, the succession plans are going to be taking care of the particular business needs, and the estate plans are going to be taking care of the farmer. So when we put those together, that's a transition plan where you have a proactive, stepped approach. So we're actively moving through the steps to take care of the farm and the farmer. That is our goal. And as we start to talk, I know that many farmers will have coffee shops. Well, that was more pre-COVID, but you will be talking with other farmers about what they did in their transition. And it's really important to understand and talk to lots of different farms to understand how they tackled the idea of transition. At the same point, it's really important that we remember your farm is unique. You have a different business setup, you have a different tax requirements, you have a different debt structure, and more importantly, you have a different family dynamic. And so those are all the different kind of components that we have to remember when we're building the plan for your farm. It's going to be different. So while you may have a neighbor that has from the road looks like exactly the same kind of an operation, same kind of land, same kind of maybe a livestock venture, same kind of number of kids, and the sons are both taken over, but you have vastly different kind of transition plans, and you may step back going, did I do it right? Why do we have such different plans? That's okay. The plans are going to be based on where your farm is going, your overall circumstance, and your family dynamics. So it's really important when you're setting those expectations to keep that in mind. And while I just explained why everything is going to be unique for your specific farm, there are also issues that were these key concerns we see in almost every client situation. So again, the control, so understanding where the assets are, where the management is, and having a communication of a common timeline so that the senior and the junior generation know what's going on. How do we deal with that non-farming children? How do we communicate with them? How much do they need to know about the business? And how do we even broach that topic? Because it seems like it's a huge topic to bear. Because if they've stepped away and if they've been gone for 20 years, their point of reference is something that isn't real. Like the farm from 20 years ago is not the same as the farm that is here today. Fair versus equal. I'm going to talk about this later in my presentation, but I will say number one reason for people to pick up and call is this question right here. What's the difference between fair versus equal, and how can I figure out that number? It's a big question, and it's a deceiving because you think, oh, fair versus equal, that seems like it's going to be just a quick question about that. But it is so intertangled with all the other kind of topics and all the other concerns that fair versus equal is where we're aiming for. That's one of the goals that we want to do. So rather than that just be a twig point or a comment, it's actually a goal that we want to get to at some point. And there's lots of questions around the fair versus equal, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Risk. Is everything already in the farm? That's a risk to some of the next generation or the senior generation because everything is already in the farm. Now, another idea of risk is in terms of the senior generation and the junior generation having different risk appetites. People are different, and we have to acknowledge that, and we need to talk through what that risk means to this transition plan. And the economies of scale and the successors plan and abilities, the retirement, farm profitability. These are all different topics that have their individual concerns that go with them, but they're very significant concerns, especially around that farm profitability, because that even in that definition is different amongst some senior and junior generations. What do they deem as profitable? And expectations. Through every part of this, I like to make sure that we step in and we're making sure that the junior expectations and the senior expectations are being communicated, because that is where things can go sideways, is because you may be having all the technical support that you want, but if either one of those generations have different expectations that are not being met, then we get into trouble. And so checking in often with everyone's expectations. And sometimes that comes right back up to that number 2 point of assets management and timelines. If any one of those get outside of different expectations, we do get into trouble. So it's important to be checking in on everyone's expectations consistently. Operating and structure, that's how we're going to do it. And I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail today about how we're going to actually execute the transition plans. We're all in the pre-transition plan. That's the whole goal for today. So when we talk about the farm, the what, I like to take my discovery calls, and I really like to dive deep into where the farm is currently, because in order to figure out where you're going, then we need to make sure we understand where you are at right now. So let's take some time to identify who is doing what. And this is an operational comment. This means who's leading in the barns, who's leading in the crops, who does the bookkeeping, who makes the decisions, who's physically doing what tasks on the farm, and make a list of it. Who's leading what? This is going to talk to the authority and the decision making. So who's taking the time to contact and negotiate with key suppliers, your processors, who's going to be making the decision for the financing, who has the authority to deal with the employees. And these two combinations is what's going to help create that management conversation or that management plan, because we need to know who's doing what right now to be able to figure out how to transition to the next generation. Who owns what? You may think that this is a pretty obvious statement, and I would say that in the vast majority of the clients that I see, this is where we get stuck for a little bit, because there is a lot of different details that go into owning what. So we have different people on different titles. We have corporations that own some pieces of land or different assets. Do we know what the exact breakdown of the company shares are? Who owns what? What's a common share? What's a preferred share? On titles, especially when we have farms side by side, do we know who's actually on title? And in some of these cases, the task after this conversation is for people to go back and pull title searches. My apologies. And that's going to give you who owns the title and if there's any liens against it. There's a lot of detail that can happen, and it provides clarity. But the other part of this conversation that sometimes catches people off guard is when we talk about who owns what. It speaks to which generation owns the farms. And for some of the younger generations, they're surprised that many of the senior or even senior generation still own key farming assets. There's been a variety of situations where I've come across where a great grandmother still owns the home farm. And we need to make a plan for that not to be the case. In the one case, that she was well into her 90s, and in one particular case, over 100. And so we need to deal with that. And when we come to the table, it's not uncommon for us to be dealing with multiple generations at once, because we have the senior or senior generation, we have that next generation, or almost like a sandwich generation, and we have a younger generation. And assets can be owned by any of them, but we need to have a clarity and have some clear communication as to who is owning what. And then who needs what? As we're starting down this pathway of figuring out what this puzzle is to make this transition plan, we need to firmly establish how the senior generation are going to be taken care of, because they've put their life and their life savings into these farms. And so we need to identify and establish how we're going to take care of their retirement. In some situations, we have extended family that may have special needs, and we have to take the time to put in special controls to make sure that they're supported. And in other ways, we have maybe a particular non-farming sibling, but may live on a particular farm. Or in a case that I've seen as well, that farm may be hosting their business. And so they're not technically part of the farm itself, but they have a special interest in some of the properties. And that needs to be identified so that people know and you can make the plan accordingly. And remember, this is more for really both generations to remember that it's not just one side of the story, it's a group story. And so I encourage the senior generation to be intentional and ask for who wants to have a voice at the table. So when we're starting the plans, let's talk through and invite that junior generation to the table to have the conversation. And I would really encourage everyone to own the transition process, be honest, be open about your wishes, and this will help avoid some secrecy. And in previous generations, there was almost a veil of secrecy over who gets the farm. It was something that was read in the will after they passed. And that's the kind of circumstance we are really trying to avoid. And in those kinds of situations, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with it. So if we can own the conversation, if we can take a proactive approach to this conversation, yes, it's going to be awkward along the way, but I think the net benefit is that we want to take the whole family with us and keep moving forward. And a common conversation I have with senior generation especially is that I ask them, have you reached out to the next generation? Have you talked to them to say, even you're meeting with me? And they say, no, I actually just want to get everything in order and then we'll talk with them. And that puts a lot of weight onto the senior generation shoulders. And again, there's so much that can be, so much more that can be accomplished when you're all working together. And so I do encourage that senior generation reach out to the junior generation so that it's a two-way conversation, and the plans that are going to come from this are going to be better and more in depth because the junior generation got to have a voice in it. And that's really, really important. And when we talk about finding common goals or finding common vision, sometimes when I'm at the kitchen table and I bring up common vision, some of the, especially the senior generation, kind of look at me funny. The whole goal here is we want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So whether you call it a common goal, a common vision, ultimately, where is the business going? Is everyone in the same path? Because this is one of the challenges that businesses, especially in farming, have, is that they've changed over years. And we have some really tough questions like, does the next generation all want to farm together? Can the next generation farm all together? And do you see the farm needing to split into different farms? Maybe operational wise, enterprise by enterprise. But if we can identify that even at the beginning to set some expectations, then we're going to build a better plan. And sometimes these conversations they're tough and they're heavy because in some cases we've just been trotting along very well and we don't necessarily want to tackle some of these bigger, heavier conversations. And that's where a third party facilitator to come in and help ask those tough questions, but also keep respect at the table so that you can find where everyone's common goals is. And again, if everybody's at the table, you're going to have a better chance of finding out where everyone's at and where people want to go. Family meetings are something that some farm families are embracing and others are seeing that they need to do them, but it seems awkward, especially if they haven't used them in the past. And taking the time to meet specifically just for transition can do a lot to clarify the expectations and clean up or set some process as to what's going to be happening. And so here's a quick example of a business meeting that I actually used. And it provides some clarity between what's a business concern and what's a family concern. And when we're talking about opportunities and opportunities and threats for the business, it also takes some time that this isn't an automatic, that this is actually an ongoing business and there are sometimes risks, there's ups and downs. And for the non-farm family kids, it's really important for them to understand that this is a thriving business. It's not just mom and dad's farm from maybe 20 or 25 years ago when they left. The business of farming has changed. And so by putting some business terms and some business expectations, it's really important for that non-farm families to acknowledge that this is a business. And it also will take some time to identify the roles for each person. So again, a prime example would be a business partner rather than the son that simply stays home. I had an example where mom and dad had a dairy farm and the son stayed home. And 15 years ago, the son started to buy in. He was an active business partner and everything was going great. And then 5 years ago, dad passed away. And so for the last number of years, he was growing the business. He was already at this point up to about 50% of the ownership of the dairy farm itself. This past year, mom passed away. And then we get to the conversation around the family. So the two sisters who had been gone for about 25 years came home. And from their perspective, the brother was simply someone who worked on the farm. And they didn't take time as a family to acknowledge that that son was not just an employee on the farm, he was a business partner. And so for the last number of years, he owns a great number of the shares of that business. And he was wanting to be fair and transparent with the sisters with the parents' equity. There was a plan in place, but there was no family meeting for everyone to communicate what had happened. So for the sisters coming back and looking at this perspective, they had 15 years of information to kind of catch up. And there was really big expectations that were put onto this because this dairy farm was also close to a rural or urban setting, and there was some more development opportunities. So the land was not just high by normal farmland situations, but it was also had some pressure. And so the expectations of the amount of money that these sisters thought that they were going to be getting was not in line with what the reality of the situation is. When you have these family business meetings, one of the things that I really encourage people to identify is that that generation that's staying home, he's no longer simply an employee. He is a business partner and he has a business share in the farming business. So sometimes using even those kinds of terms is helpful. So as we move through and we talk about transition, a lot of times what we're going to hear is they're going to talk about the tax and the business structures, the details of how they actually transition assets, how they transition the business. And then they're going to talk about the whole aspects of life insurance, investments, and wills. And those are all incredibly important topics. And there's an army of people out there who are prepared and willing to talk about all of those. But the reality is those aren't the only topics that need to be addressed. If you can identify some of these other pieces of the pie, so to speak, then you're going to be able to build the better plan with those technical aspects. But if you can take the time initially to deal with more than just the structure and the taxes and the estate, then people are going to be less frustrated with the process because they felt like they've dealt with the whole breadth of comments and the whole breadth of complexity, not just focusing on the technical aspects. So when I say what's the other pieces of the pie, let's take some more time to kind of drill down on what that is. So number one, I've already broached it, goal setting. Let's be clear about what the end goal is and how we're going to get and what that end goal is, period. We just need to set some goals. Decision making and the roles that go with that. So we're going to define, is this a junior generation? Is this a senior generation? Is this a family decision or is this a business decision? So setting those expectations and having clear lines is really going to be helpful in moving this conversation forward. Conflict management. We have family dynamics. We have businesses that are not necessarily, there's a lot of risk with some of these businesses, and there's likely to be some conflict. At any point, there's probably going to be, and the more people you add to it, there's likely going to be some aspect where people are not always going to agree. But let's, before we get to that point, identify how a process and how we can deal with that conflict, so then that doesn't stop us in our tracks. It's something that we need to deal with, and then we have a plan on how we're going to tackle that conflict, as opposed to just stopping outright. Training the successors. This is incredibly important to make sure that the next generation is set up for the success of the business. And so the legacy is that you grow in and you know what, you figure it out as you go. But farms today are extremely large, they're extremely complex, and having a formal training plan for them to take over that next set of challenges is incredibly important. So be intentional and make sure that you're setting that next generation up for success. So these are all kind of grouped together. So we have communication plans and then dealing with non-farm siblings and children. And when we talk about family and when we're talking with family, please recognize this can be an emotional conversation. We have kids who are farming and that this is their future, and they may have heard promises. I think we've all heard them. This is all going to be yours someday, that kind of thing. And they're worried and they're wondering if that promise is going to be met. And then we have the non-farm siblings who may be left, but they still see the farm as their legacy. This is part of their past. And this business may have grown from something that they're not familiar with, especially for some of the non-farm siblings who have been gone for a number of years. That can be hard, and it may feel like they've lost that family connection because the business is not something that they recognize or not something that they see and they can connect with. So in those kinds of situations, when we have an emotionally charged situation, bringing in the facilitator as part of that transition management team can help keep the emotions in check and still keep that transition plan going. Because as we've kind of highlighted here, there's so many different topics outside of the business and the taxes and the wills that need to get addressed in a transition plan. I'm just going to keep adding different issues onto this. And so these are some what people refer to the 5Ds. And these are the things that keep people up at night. So we have all of the technical and these emotional concerns that we've already addressed. And these are the 5Ds that people, They're not even sure how to ask about them. And they're something that is also has an emotional connection to. So divorce, for example, a number of senior generation looking at the junior generation saying, what if my son gets divorced and that daughter-in-law takes all of our equity away? Is there any way that we can protect that? And that's a real question. Yes, there is ways that you can do this, but in order for your technical experts like your lawyers to help you do that, they need to know it's an issue and it's a concern. So if you have that concern, bring it up. And the other part of this conversation is a lot of times the senior generation are very focused on the next generation, but it can happen in the first generation too. So keep an open mind that when we're talking about these issues, it's not just all once and done. It can go either way. Disposition, so you transition the farm, maybe at a really low value, or you even gift a farm to the next generation, and then all of a sudden they keep all the cash. They're going to sell it and they're going to run away with all that cash. So is there ways to help protect that equity? Yes, there are. And there's clauses that you can put in the buy-sell agreements or any kind of agreement. Again, that's something that you're going to want to talk to your lawyer about. Debt. Now, so if your senior generation in this example maybe sells it to the junior generation at a below market value, and the junior generation uses that farm to leverage for whatever kind of expansion they want, there's generally a topic of conversation or a concern from the senior generation about debt. And this will stem from the fact that they have different expectations for risk. They have different appetites for how much debt is okay. And so it's important to have that conversation before the farm is sold rather than afterwards. So get those issues out and own them before it actually becomes an issue. And death. We all plan for the fact that the senior generation is going to pass away, but what happens when the next generation or that junior generation dies before the senior generation? These plans, the transition plans, in so many cases have different layers and have different aspects of how they can be structured so that it'll give you some time to make the decisions as to what you're going to deal with if that child does pass away. There's still some scenario building that sometimes we talk about when we're building these transition plans, so that you're still going to have aspects of the transition plan that can be applied even if the worst happens. And dementia, I should say. What happens when you're just not thinking clearly? And as I mentioned, when we have an age demographic within the Canadian agriculture that are older, this is something that we're seeing a lot more common. So the sooner that you can acknowledge, transition, and start into the process, the better you're going to be in a position to protect and put some specific controls in place so that you can deal with this before it happens. But it's a very, very real issue. So we've talked a lot about bringing in the experts, and whether your current accountant or lawyer or financial planner have the expertise in this particular situation, they may, but they also might need to reach out to actual specialists, because just like your doctor, your accountant may need to lean on special tax accountants, or your corporate or your lawyers may need to go into marital lawyers. They need to lean on corporate lawyers. So there's a lot of different experts that can be leaned on in this particular situation to help build a better plan. And it's also important to remember that your experts, so your lawyers, your financial planners, your accountants, they're there to execute your wishes, which means that you need to tell them what you want to do. And so they can't make the decisions for you. They're there to help you. They're there to action the plans, but the ultimate decisions are up to you. So it's important when you are working with these experts and you're trying to make these decisions and collect all this information that you still listen to your instincts, because if you aren't clear on the steps that are being taken, ask for clarity. If you aren't comfortable with the proposed solution, you need to ask for more options. And if you feel like you're just not heard and you're just not moving along in the process that you want, you are encouraged to get a second opinion. That second opinion can either validate that proposal or it can highlight another alternative. With that being said, please don't underestimate the value of an advisor who will call the baby ugly, or in this case, and I mean, this is a picture of a baby that only a mother can love, but sometimes good advisors will tell you what you don't want to hear. And sometimes that's really hard to hear. Advisors do have the best interest of you in mind, and they are a valuable asset. With that being said, they're not trying to be mean with you, but maybe they are trying to protect you from a bad situation that you can't even see right now. So people have blind spots, and especially in the cases of families, they have soft spots. So advisors are there to help you see that whole picture, and recognize when a baby just isn't cute. I would also say be aware of the path of least resistance. So as humans, we love to take the path of least resistance. It's part of who we are from the beginning of time. People and humans have tried to find easier ways to do things. An example that I would have is that a junior and senior partner had just actually gone through the transition plan. And so the senior partner was stepping out, the junior partner was stepping in. And the senior partner had had a long-term relationship with an accountant. But the junior partner didn't really have a very good relationship with them. Because it was easier and he didn't have the time to go out and find a different accountant or whatever the case may be, he just stayed with him. So it was easier, but because they didn't have a good relationship, it wasn't necessarily a beneficial relationship for the junior generation because he didn't feel that he was a trusted partner. So just because it's easy doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best fit. So take the time, put in the effort, especially when it comes to your advisors, because they are an investment into your farm and they're there to help you. So I feel like I've kind of talked through a lot of different things, and I have 4 things to keep in mind. So number 1, that there's no such thing as a cookie cutter transition. So transition plans can take years. This was right back to the beginning of my presentation. Every transition is unique. Yours will be too. Find a common vision, common goal, whatever you want to call it, with everyone who's involved. Junior and senior generation, or in some of these cases, we have senior generation, the junior generation, and making sure that everybody has a place at the table to have their thoughts and their concerns viewed. And leverage the experts to figure out the how. I would encourage that farmers focus on where you're going and all the moving parts of how it's going to happen, but don't necessarily go in with a very, very explicit, this is how I want to do it. I want to specifically roll my farm over from one generation to the next, because what that does is it tells the your financial planner that this is your expectation. So if you could, rather than be so specific about that, go in and say, you know what, I want this child to have this farm. What options are available to me? That's going to give you more information, and that's going to help move your transition plan. And it's going to tell your technical support that you're also there to have a conversation. It's not just a transactional need, that they're going to be an option to have some open conversation and talk about what other things you can do. So remember that you are the expert of where this is going. This is your farm. You know where you want it to go. You know your family. And I encourage you to take some time to look at the big picture. And how we're going to start is we're going to talk about really bringing it back down to that operational level of understanding who's doing what, understand who's leading what, who owns what, and who needs what. And that's going to be a good foundation for you to then take that information and reach out to your technical experts so that they can give you some information, and then you're going to start this whole process on trying to get to your transition plan. And the sooner that you start, the more options you're going to have available. So here's my information. And with that, I think, Nash, I believe you're going to be coming back on and helping with some questions.
I'm back. Can you see me?
I can.
Okay. Great presentation, Andrea. That
Thank
was
you.
so informative. Really, really informative. So yeah, so I've got a couple questions here, but before we dive into that, I just want to say thank you again to FCC for sponsoring today's live webinar. And let's get to the first one. So if there is confusion with the senior generation or the seller, would you bring in a facilitator for that? So
Yeah.
I know you spoke on dementia, so maybe that's what it's referring to.
Yeah, and sometimes the confusion too can lead to terms. That's one aspect where sometimes as a facilitator, I'll go in and the senior generation isn't familiar with the financial terms that are being used, and so sometimes there's confusion, yes, because of dementia, but in other cases, they're using different language that they're just not familiar with. A prime example would be I had a situation last week where the senior generation said, they're freezing all my assets. And I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing. That's going to be part of the transition. This is what we're supposed to. But he did not understand the terms. He understood some of the bigger plan, but he didn't understand the financial terms that are being used. So that's one kind of situation. Another is if there is some dementia there, it's again good to explain to your facilitator the circumstance that they're walking into to make sure that everybody understands what's going on so that people can be better prepared to support the family, whether that's the senior generation or the junior generation.
Well, that makes sense. Okay, so let's see here. What's the next one? Okay, so what if the junior generation has an alternative career as well while taking over the farm?
Yeah, that is absolutely very common. And this is a really good part about talking about expectations, because if the senior generation, do they understand that that other career path is going to be continuing? Do they understand that? Does the business need to change with this other business venture being a part of the overall plan? So maybe as the business stands right now, having somebody who's working off farm isn't necessarily very functional. But if the goal is that the junior generation still wants to work off farm, then maybe we need to talk about some alternatives for how we can modify the farm so that it can continue to go forward. So talking honestly about what the expectations of the management and who's doing what can set up some of those hurdles before you get there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so now the next question is, what is the biggest lesson learned you've seen an operation go through after a failure?
Yes. So communication. I've had a couple situations where they'll start the conversation by saying, well, we started this 8 years ago and then it just didn't go anywhere, or there was a whole bunch of confusion and we stopped. And in many of those cases, it's because either position or multiple positions were not clearly identified. And one of the aspects that you can help that with is to bring people to the table and communicate at once. We don't want to be doing the real life example of the telephone game from when you were younger, where one person hears one thing, they pick up the phone, they call the next person, and they give their interpretation of what they heard. That is something that's all common. And one of the things that I do have to see is that if everybody's not at the same table, and sometimes even if they are, they will hear different things. And when we have a situation where the transition didn't continue, it typically does come back to communication and knowing if people understood what was being asked.
Yeah, so would you do exactly that? Ask that question? What, did you just understand what was said? Do you kind of make them re-say the question or the statement?
Absolutely. And sometimes I may not be that direct. I may be asking questions of how they're going to take their next steps. So then that takes it from, they're not just going to take my words and give them back to me. They're going to say, here's how I'm going to apply what was just said. And I think that's where the greater understanding and saying, okay, now we can start to move forward because they truly do understand what's being asked here.
Yeah, I think it comes back down to the expectations, right? Setting it. Sometimes you, as the advisor would have to kind of drag that out of them.
Yeah, and it's usually, they'll start with an expectation And then in my experience, there's never just one expectation. It's kind of a layers, and there's a whole bunch of series of expectations. And so it, the more that we know and the more that you share, the better job we can do with helping facilitate what you're doing. Because I'm not making any of the decisions, but I'm wanting you to make the best decisions with the information that you need. So if you can tell me what your expectations are, then we can get you better information to be able to make those decisions.
Great. Okay, next question, Andrea, is what common issue holds families back from starting the transition process?
I would say the biggest hurdle is to where to start. In lots of times, people just don't even know where to begin because it feels like it's a big puzzle. There's so many unknowns, and they don't know, do we start with our accountant? Do we start with our lawyer? Do we start with our kids? That's a really big challenge. And I would say another big challenge is if they don't have that next generation that's clearly identified to say, yeah, I'm going to come home and take over the farm, what then? So for some of them, they have farms, they have businesses that they would like to transition, but they want to give the next generation some time, or maybe they're just not even sure if they have a successor to come home to. So those are some of the big things, is where do they start and do they have a successor?
Have you ever come across a senior generation not wanting to pass it on to the junior generation? And
Oh yeah.
what conversation is that?
I recently had a lovely lady. She was 94, and she's like, you know what? I feel really good. I don't think I need to. Like, well, you know what, sweetheart? I think it's about time we start this process. And for her, I've seen some situations where it's not nearly as positive. For her, she was just feeling great. She had a good working relationship with her son. Her son had a different business, and she just felt like she's got lots of time ahead of her. So why rush? And I mean, so she was lovely. She was still living on her own. I mean, that is definitely a goal of where you want to go. So that's one circumstance where maybe just not realizing their age. Like in some cases, it's like, oh, I am that old. Okay, maybe I should start this, but I don't want to die tomorrow. So if I transition my farm, is that going to happen? And it's like, no. And this is going to take time. Back to that original comment that this is a process. It's not just going to happen overnight. Because if it does happen overnight, that's when somebody died. And that's not good. That's what we want to avoid. But I have seen, and this is another reality, is that not everybody is a really positive and loving situation. And some people want to retain control, and they want to be in control of it until they die. And that is, honest to goodness, a big part of some of the challenges that we're addressing, is that they don't want to deal with it, and they just want to have control of their farms until they can't.
Yeah, and that's more of a, I guess, a reactive instead of a proactive approach. And yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so we have one last question before we go on to the QR code thing. So he's asking, I want to start making steps to transition the farm, but the older generation won't even discuss it. So this is kind of the opposite of what we were just talking. How do I move forward?
Yeah, yeah. And you know what? I've seen this in the opposite situations. I've seen situations where the senior generation really want the junior generation to come home and do this, and they're not prepared to talk. Or I've seen it in the opposite situation where the junior generation really want to get started, and the seniors are like, we're not prepared to have that conversation. So it can go both ways. In either way, I think both generation, pace and grace is something that I've heard, and it really resonates with me. So one, are you guys, this as senior and junior generations, are you both going at the same pace? Because if the junior generation is sprinting and the older generation is like crawling, that's going to be a problem. We need to get you both at a similar spot where you're at the same kind of pace. And grace is speaking to the fact that we need to take a step back and remember that this is hard for the senior generation to be making some of these acknowledgments, and maybe not intending, but that junior generation can be very forceful. And sometimes it's important for that junior generation to try to walk in the senior generation shoes and understand the complexity, all the different issues that need to be addressed, because we just had a presentation on all the different things. This is not just as simple as, oh, well, just put me on the title of the farm. There's a lot of other conversations. There's a lot of other emotions that come to the table. And so sometimes I find that the junior generation doesn't necessarily understand the complexity of the situation. So if you take some time to have some grace and say, can we even have this conversation, or asking about how you can help them rather than I want, that's another really good place to start, is to say that, you know what, I'm here to help you. I want to help build this farm. I want to help continue your legacy. And sometimes changing your words matters too.
Do you offer, like on your website on fcc.com, do you have, or .ca, sorry.
That's yay. No
Okay.
worries.
Is there like a template of questions? Like this is how you kind of get started, just to do a little bit of the pre-work before they connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go into fcc.ca and then you go under the resources tab and you click on transition services, there's actually a whole library of information there. So there's going to be some videos of one of my colleagues, Patty Duran, on talking about how we broach those tough conversations. There's also PDFs that have the checklist of saying, okay, we're going to start with management. We're not going to even broach the topic of ownership. Maybe we're just going to start by talking about the management. So let's do an assessment. When I was talking about the who does what and who manages what, that's kind of that core start of the management piece of it. So you're going to talk through and identify who's doing what on the farm right now. So then you can say, you know what, this is a really stressful task. Can I start helping you with it? And it's biting it off in smaller pieces. And then there's also some resources on how to frame the conversation as a whole, to say your transition as a whole, this is going to be some of the issues and some of the topics that we're going to be discussing or dealing with.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think that would be super helpful for a lot of these families. Okay, so I know we have one last slide to get to, Andrea, for the professional development credits. So let's see if we can get that.
There we go.
Okay, so attendees, before we end today, here is your chance to collect one CCA CEU in professional development. To collect the credit for this webinar, you have to open your CAA app on your smartphone and then click scan course code and hold your phone up to the monitor so that the camera can hover over the QR code. If you are able to do this, your CEUs will be submitted immediately. If this doesn't work for you, please email your first name, last name, and CCA number to webinars@Annex Business Media. Annex is ANNEX, businessmedia.com, and we'll submit your credits for you. And then a follow-up email will also be sent out within 24 hours, which will hold this recording of Andrea's transition talk and our email address for any feedback. So any questions that you have, or if you're having a problem submitting your CAA or CCA information. So I want to say thank you for tuning in today to the webinar. Please visit fruitandveggie.com/webinars to view this again and to view all of our recorded webinars and register for any upcoming webinars. So thank you again, Andrea. Really appreciate it. Great talk.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everybody.